I am Stella, 34 years old, and until recently, I was the sole financial provider for a man who believed his mere existence was a gift to the world. My husband, who lived entirely off my grueling corporate income, texted me while I was on a business trip. "Why have you not sent my $4,000 monthly allowance? Do you want me to get mad and divorce you?" I stood in the airport lounge and replied, "I divorced you yesterday." His response was a single confused word. Huh. He had no idea his empire was about to crumble. Let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a partner who completely underestimated your intelligence. My flight from Tokyo had landed at JFK International Airport just an hour earlier. As a senior director of mergers and acquisitions at a Wall Street firm, my days were a blur of financial structuring. I had spent 2 weeks in Japan closing a corporate buyout, surviving on minimal sleep and caffeine. My body ached for my own bed, but returning to my life in New York meant returning to Brandon. Brandon was 35 and considered himself a tech entrepreneur. In reality, he was a failure whose only successful venture was convincing me to fund his delusions. When we married 5 years ago, he was charming and full of big ideas. Over time, those ideas morphed into endless startup concepts that required constant capital injections from my accounts. He spent his days networking and nights entertaining imaginary investors while I worked 80-hour weeks to keep us afloat. The text message was just another entitled demand. He threatened divorce whenever I questioned his spending, assuming I was too afraid to call his bluff. He was wrong. I caught a car back to Manhattan, mentally preparing for the chaos. I owned a $3 million penthouse overlooking the city, purchased entirely with my own money before our wedding. Lately, it felt less like a home and more like a clubhouse for Brandon and his entitled family. When the elevator doors opened directly into my penthouse, the thumping bass of house music hit me like a physical wall. The entryway was littered with expensive coats and designer shoes. The air smelled of overpriced cologne and roasted truffles. I stepped into my own living room to find at least 50 people holding crystal champagne flutes, laughing loudly, and eating from lavish silver catering trays. Brandon was throwing a party for his latest phantom business venture, undoubtedly paid for using the supplementary credit card tied directly to my primary account. I navigated through the sea of strangers, my suitcase trailing behind me. No one recognized the actual owner of the apartment. They just saw a tired woman ruining the aesthetic of their gathering. As I made my way toward the kitchen to grab a glass of water, a voice cut through the music. "Well, look who finally decided to show up and kill the mood." I turned to see my mother-in-law, Barbara, holding a plate of imported caviar appetizers. At 60 years old, Barbara treated my home as her personal resort. She firmly believed that a woman's only true purpose was to serve her husband, a philosophy she applied eagerly to my marriage, while conveniently ignoring that my paycheck funded her weekly spa treatments. Barbara stepped closer, her eyes raking over my travel-worn appearance with open disgust. She gestured wildly with her wineglass as she spoke, intentionally sloshing red wine directly onto the lapel of my custom-tailored suit jacket. "Oh, my apologies, daughter-in-law," Barbara sneered. "This cheap fabric probably cannot handle a decent vintage anyway. You really should go upstairs and clean yourself up. You look like one of the catering staff. Actually, maybe you should grab a rag and wipe down the guest bathroom. You are always so good at doing boring tasks like your little accounting job." I looked down at the dark stain. For years, I had swallowed her insults to keep the peace. I had played the role of the quiet wife who paid the bills while her genius husband changed the world. Barbara truly believed I was nothing more than a dull number cruncher, oblivious to the fact that my little accounting job involved dismantling massive corporate fraud schemes. I did not raise my voice. I simply grabbed a napkin, dabbed at the wine, and tossed the soiled paper onto her plate of caviar. "That was vintage as well," I said smoothly. "Enjoy." Before Barbara could formulate a response, Brandon materialized from the crowd. He wore a designer tuxedo that I had paid for last month. His face flushed with anger the moment he saw me. He did not ask about my flight. He did not ask about my 2 weeks in Tokyo. Instead, he aggressively grabbed my suitcase handle, yanking it away from me. "What are you doing playing mind games over text?" Brandon demanded, his voice low and threatening. I do not have time for your emotional outbursts today. My investors are here. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents, slamming them onto the marble kitchen counter right in front of me. Stop acting crazy and sign these right now, he ordered. It is the corporate guarantee for a $500,000 line of credit. My new app is launching next month, and we need the operational capital. Sign it, or I swear to God you can pack this suitcase back up and find somewhere else to sleep tonight. I looked at the documents, then up at my husband. He honestly believed he held all the power. He believed he could throw me out of my own home. He was so incredibly blind to the harsh reality. I smiled warmly and reached for the pen. I held the silver fountain pen between my fingers, letting the cool metal rest against my skin. The document Brandon had slammed onto the marble counter was a commercial line of credit application. The principal amount requested was $500,000. He had already filled out my personal information, my social security number, my annual income, and my corporate title. All that was missing was my signature at the bottom of the page. He wanted me to personally guarantee a loan for another one of his visionary ideas while I was still exhausted from a 14-hour flight. Brandon tapped his knuckles against the countertop. Do not just stare at it, Stella. Sign the paper. The developers in Silicon Valley are waiting for the wire transfer. If we do not secure this capital by tomorrow morning, my co-founders are going to walk away. This app is going to revolutionize the fitness industry. I just need you to co-sign so the bank releases the funds. I placed the pen down on the counter. It made a sharp click against the marble. I am not signing a $500,000 loan for an app that tracks how many times people go to the gym, Brandon. There are 100 apps that do that for free. His face darkened. His jaw tightened as he stepped closer, invading my personal space. This was his usual tactic, intimidation disguised as passion. You do not understand tech, Stella. You do not understand innovation. You sit in a cubicle all day looking at spreadsheets. I am building an empire. To prove his point, he reached for my leather work bag resting on the stool next to me. He unzipped it and dumped the contents directly onto the floor. Hundreds of pages of confidential merger and acquisition documents, contracts I had spent the last 2 weeks negotiating in Tokyo, scattered across the hardwood. My laptop slid out and hit the floor with a heavy thud. Look at this garbage, Brandon sneered, kicking a stack of papers with his expensive Italian loafers. This is what you do with your life. You manage money for other people. You are just a glorified accountant. I am a creator, but I cannot create when my own wife acts like a financial anchor dragging me down. I need a supportive partner, not a corporate drone who questions my genius every time I ask for basic seed money. Basic seed money. I looked at the mess on the floor, then back at my husband. 5 years of marriage flashed through my mind, neatly categorized by his financial disasters. There was the $200,000 he lost on a blockchain platform for dog walkers. There was the $150,000 he poured into a premium water delivery service that never sold a single bottle. I had covered his debts every single time, working overtime, missing holidays, and sacrificing my own peace of mind to protect him from bankruptcy. He had taken my money, my credit, and my youth, all while treating my demanding career as a pathetic joke. You are quiet, Brandon said, misinterpreting my silence as submission. He picked up the pen and shoved it toward my chest. Good. Keep quiet and sign the paper. My investors are watching us right now. Do not embarrass me in front of them. You owe me this. You owe this marriage your full support. I looked past him. The party guests in my living room were pretending not to watch, but their eyes kept darting toward the kitchen. They were drinking my champagne and eating my food, all waiting for the boring corporate wife to write another blank check for the charismatic visionary. I took the pen from his hand. Brandon smiled, a smug, victorious expression settling over his features. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, ready to return to his audience the moment my signature was dry. I set the pen back down on the counter. Then I picked up the loan application. I held the crisp white paper in my hands, feeling the weight of the $500,000 he expected me to throw away. I turned my back to him and walked slowly toward the home office area, just off the kitchen. Where are you going? Brandon demanded, his voice rising in panic. Just sign it right there. The bank needs the original copy. I did not stop walking. I reached the heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sitting next to my desk. I flipped the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, menacing growl. Stella. What are you doing? Brandon yelled, rushing toward me. I held the document over the feeding slot. I am restructuring my liabilities, I said softly. I dropped the application into the shredder. The steel blades caught the thick paper, instantly ripping his $500,000 demand into thousands of tiny, unreadable confetti strips. The grinding noise echoed through the penthouse, slicing through the thumping bass of the house music. Several party guests gasped. The music suddenly felt entirely too loud for the dead silence that fell over the kitchen. Brandon stopped dead in his tracks. He stared at the plastic bin filling up with shredded paper. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The smug confidence had been entirely wiped from his face, replaced by a look of sheer unadulterated shock. He had never been denied before, not like this, not in public. Are you out of your mind? Brandon roared, his voice cracking with rage. You vindictive, selfish woman. You think you hold the power because you bring home a paycheck. I will not tolerate this disrespect. If you do not wire the funds to my account tomorrow morning, I am calling my lawyer. I will file for divorce so fast your head will spin. I am legally entitled to take away half of your entire retirement, half your stock portfolio, and half of this luxury penthouse. Before the last echo of his threat could settle in the vast space of the kitchen, Barbara shoved her way past a group of terrified party guests and planted herself directly between her son and me. She threw her arms out, shielding Brandon, as if my paper shredder posed a lethal threat to his existence. Her designer silk shawl fluttered as she pointed a manicured finger right at my face. You listen to me, Stella, Barbara shrieked, her voice cracking with indignation. You lost your mind. My son gave you his best years, and this is how you repay him, by humiliating him in front of his business associates. I looked at the woman who spent half a decade treating my home like a free hotel. I am protecting my assets, Barbara. Something your son refuses to do for himself. Barbara let out a harsh laugh that echoed off the ceilings. Your assets, please. You should be down on your knees thanking God every single day that a man of Brandon's caliber even looked twice at you. Do not forget where you came from, Stella. You were a scrappy state college girl drowning in loans when he found you. We gave you class. We gave you a respectable family name. You work like a dog 80 hours a week, neglecting your wifely duties, neglecting your home, and Brandon tolerates it because he has a heart of gold. Any other man would have left a cold corporate machine like you years ago. The action-based backstory spilled from her lips like poison, completely ignoring the fact that my 80-hour weeks had paid off her reverse mortgage last year. It was always the same narrative with them. My success was an inconvenience, my background was a stain, and Brandon was a saint for putting up with a woman who out-earned him tenfold. Brandon stepped out from behind his mother, his confidence fully restored by her vicious defense. He smoothed his tuxedo lapels and looked around the room, making sure his audience was paying attention. The music had been completely muted by one of the caterers. Dozens of people were watching us, some even holding up their phones to record the drama. Brandon loved an audience. My mother is right, Brandon said, raising his chin. You have completely lost touch with reality. You care more about your spreadsheets than your own husband. If you think you can just destroy my funding application and walk away, you are delusional. I will call my attorney first thing tomorrow morning. He smirked, waiting for me to break down. He expected me to cry, to beg, to apologize, and write the check just to save my carefully constructed life from being torn apart in court. Instead, I reached into my tote bag. I pulled out my tablet and tapped the screen. I walked past Brandon and Barbara into the center of the sunken living room. I pointed my tablet at the massive television mounted above the fireplace. I pressed the screen mirroring button. The screen flashed blue before my document appeared in high definition for everyone to see. What are you doing? Brandon demanded, marching toward me. Turn that off. I stepped aside so he had a clear view of the screen. I am just helping you with your simple math. Brandon, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. You see, you cannot call your attorney to file for divorce tomorrow morning. He scoffed, crossing his arms. Watch me. You cannot file for divorce tomorrow. I continued, keeping my eyes locked on his, because I already filed for divorce 6 months ago. The room erupted in gasps. Barbara clutched her chest, her mouth falling open. Brandon froze, his eyes darting from me to the massive television screen. Displayed in stark black and white was an official document from the New York State Supreme Court. At the very top, in bold, unmistakable letters, were the words, "Default Judgment of Divorce." "That is impossible," Brandon stammered, his face draining of color. "I never signed anything. I never saw any papers. You are bluffing. This is a fake document." I shook my head slowly, savoring the moment. "It is very real, Brandon. I had you served legally and properly at this exact address. The process server handed the envelope directly to you 3 separate times over the last 6 months. But since you are so busy building your visionary tech empire, you have a habit of throwing away anything that looks like boring adult paperwork. You assumed the thick manila envelopes were just junk mail, or perhaps debt collectors for your last failed startup. You tossed them right into the trash without even opening them." He stepped back, staring at the screen as if it were a bomb about to detonate. No, you cannot do that. That is illegal. You have to tell me." "I do not have to tell you," I replied smoothly. "The law requires me to serve you." I did. "The law requires you to respond within 30 days. You did not. You ignored the summons while you were out partying on my dime. When a respondent fails to answer a legal summons, the petitioner is entitled to request a default judgment." I pointed to the judge's digital signature at the bottom of the screen. "He signed this decree at exactly 4:00 yesterday afternoon. As of yesterday, we are no longer married, Brandon. You have absolutely no legal claim to me or my assets." The silence in the kitchen lasted exactly 3 seconds before the entire room erupted into chaos. The catering staff froze in their tracks, lowering their silver serving trays. The party guests began whispering frantically to one another, some edging toward the coat check to make a quick and quiet exit. Barbara let out a dramatic sound that was half gasp and half shriek, clutching her heavy pearl necklace as if the physical weight of my words had struck her directly in the chest. Brandon stared at the massive television screen mounted above the fireplace. The digital signature of the New York State Supreme Court judge glowed in high definition. His face cycled through a rapid progression of emotions. First came absolute denial, then wild confusion, and finally, the familiar and explosive anger that I had spent 5 long years tiptoeing around. He slammed his fist down on the marble island, rattling the crystal champagne glasses left behind by fleeing guests. "You think you are so incredibly smart, Stella. You think you can just pull a fast one on me with some obscure legal loophole." He jabbed a rigid finger toward my face, stepping so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You are forgetting one minor detail about New York divorce law. It is an equitable distribution state. Default judgment or not, the law dictates that marital assets are divided fairly." Barbara snapped out of her initial shock and immediately rallied behind her precious son. "That is exactly right." She pointed at me, her face flushed with fury. "You cannot just lock him out of his own life. My son contributed heavily to this marriage. He supported your career. While you were flying around the world ignoring your duties as a wife, Brandon was here maintaining this home. He built his professional network from this very apartment. He is entitled to half of everything you have." Brandon nodded enthusiastically, his toxic confidence returning with his mother backing him up. He paced back and forth in front of the kitchen island, performing for the remaining guests who were simply too nosy to leave. He loved playing the victim, portraying himself as the brilliant mastermind held back by his ungrateful spouse. "Half, Stella." Brandon shouted, his voice echoing loudly off the high ceilings. "That means 50% of your 401k, 50% of your stock options, and most importantly, 50% of this $3 million penthouse. I am going to force the sale of this property. I will have my lawyers file a motion tomorrow morning to put this place on the market. We will liquidate it entirely, and I will take my $1.5 million in cash. You are going to write me a massive check, and I will use your hard-earned corporate money to launch my tech company without you. You played yourself. He crossed his arms defensively, wearing that same arrogant smirk he always used when he firmly believed he had won an argument. He expected me to panic. He expected me to drop to my knees and realize that my default judgment had a massive financial flaw. I walked over to the kitchen island and calmly poured myself a fresh glass of sparkling water. I took a slow sip, letting him savor his imaginary victory for just a few seconds longer. You are absolutely right about New York being an equitable distribution state, Brandon, I said smoothly, setting the glass down on the counter. Marital assets acquired during the marriage are indeed subject to division. Which brings us to a very important legal distinction. I picked up my tablet and swiped to the next page of the legal file. I mirrored it directly to the television screen. The divorce decree disappeared, replaced by a dense legal property deed. I enlarged the specific section showing the registered owner of the penthouse. Take a close look at the exact name on the deed, Brandon. Brandon squinted at the screen, his brow furrowed in deep confusion. Vanguard Holdings LLC. What is that? Some shell company you set up. It does not matter. If you own the LLC, it is still a marital asset. You cannot hide real estate behind a corporate name and expect the court to ignore it. I smiled, leaning comfortably against the marble counter. I do not own Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Barbara scoffed loudly, stepping forward. Do not lie to us, Stella. We know you bought this place right before the wedding. You bragged about it. You used your massive Wall Street bonus to pay the down payment. It is your apartment which makes it his apartment. I did pay the down payment, I agreed softly. But I never put the deed in my name. 3 years before I even met your son, I established an irrevocable blind corporate trust in Delaware. I structured it carefully so that I am merely a beneficiary, not the legal owner of the assets contained within it. When I purchased this penthouse, the trust bought it. Vanguard Holdings, LLC is wholly owned by that trust. I do not legally own this real estate. The trust legally owns it. Brandon stared at the screen, the color completely draining from his face. His mouth opened, but he struggled to find the right words. Wait a minute. What are you saying? I am saying that this penthouse is not a marital asset. I clarified, enunciating every single word, so there could be no misunderstanding. It never was. You cannot force the sale of a property I do not own. You cannot claim half the equity of an asset that belongs to a completely separate legal entity. I personally structured my entire financial portfolio through this trust long before you and I walked down the church aisle. My retirement accounts, my stock portfolio, and this $3 million piece of real estate are completely untouchable. The heavy silence in the grand living room was absolutely deafening. No one moved a muscle or dared to whisper a word. The silence stretched heavy and suffocating until a sharp, mocking laugh broke through the tension. It was Trey. Brandon's older brother shoved his way to the front of the crowd, his custom-tailored suit straining against his broad shoulders. He shot his cuffs, deliberately flashing the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist. I knew for a fact he had bought that watch using a high-interest personal loan. Trey clapped a heavy hand on Brandon's shoulder, squeezing it tight. Let her keep her little apartment, little brother. Let her keep her boring retirement accounts. We do not need her pennies anymore. Trey looked me up and down with absolute disgust. You really think you did something here, Stella? You think you are a mastermind because you hid some real estate in a trust. You are nothing but a wage slave. You trade your life for a salary, terrified to take a real risk. You will be crunching numbers in a cubicle until you are 70 years old. But us, we just leveled up. Brandon's chest puffed out, drawing strength from his brother's arrogant energy. Trey grinned, turning his attention to the crowd of stunned party guests. For those of you who have not heard the good news yet, Brandon and I just secured $5 million in seed funding for our new decentralized crypto exchange. $5 million in liquid capital. We closed the round yesterday with a syndicate of anonymous offshore investors who actually recognize our potential. So go ahead, Stella, keep your penthouse. We can buy 10 of these by next year. I looked at the two brothers standing shoulder to shoulder, practically vibrating with unearned arrogance. They were so incredibly predictable. I stepped away from the kitchen island and crouched down to retrieve my laptop from the scattered mess Brandon had made on the floor. The metal casing was slightly dented, but the screen flared to life instantly when I opened it. I walked back to the center of the living room, typing quickly. I swiped a cable from the media console, plugging it directly into the side of my laptop. The massive television screen shifted from the real estate deed to a complex network of banking dashboards, corporate registries, and international wire transfer logs. Anonymous offshore investors. I repeated, testing the words on my tongue. You mean the Cyprus-based venture capital firm that wired you the $5 million yesterday afternoon? Trey smirked, crossing his arms over his chest. Exactly. Real players. People who deal in 8-figure portfolios and understand market disruption. They saw our pitch deck, saw the revolutionary algorithm Brandon designed, and wired the funds without a single hesitation. That is how real business is done, Stella, not hoarding pennies in a basic checking account. I tapped a key on my laptop keyboard. A new window opened on the television screen. It was the official corporate registry document from the Republic of Cyprus for the specific venture capital firm that had funded their project. The document detailed the corporate structure, listing the primary holding company that owned the venture fund. Another tap of the keyboard brought up the incorporation documents for that exact holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. I kept typing, drilling down through the layers of corporate obfuscation. You see, Trey, you and Brandon have a fundamental misunderstanding of how international finance works. You assume that just because money comes from an account in Cyprus, it is entirely untraceable. You assume that anonymous means nobody knows who is actually pulling the strings. But I am a senior director of mergers and acquisitions. Tracking disguised capital through offshore shell companies is literally what I do for a living. I do it for multi-billion-dollar global conglomerates. So unraveling the funding for your little crypto project took me exactly 20 minutes during a layover in Tokyo. Brandon frowned, his eyes narrowing at the glowing screen. What are you talking about? They signed a strict non-disclosure agreement. You cannot access those financial records. They are deeply protected by international banking privacy laws. I smiled, a genuine and cold expression. I brought up the final digital document. It was the ultimate beneficiary declaration for the Cayman Islands Holding Company. The screen displayed the name clearly in bold black letters. The sole beneficiary and controlling director of the entire venture capital network was Vanguard Holdings, LLC. The color completely vanished from Trey's face. His arrogant smirk collapsed into a grimace of pure panic. I pointed to the screen. Does that specific corporate name look familiar to you, boys? I told you 5 minutes ago that my blind corporate trust owns Vanguard Holdings. Vanguard Holdings owns the Cayman Shell Company. The Cayman Shell Company owns the Cyprus venture firm. Do you understand what I am telling you? There are no anonymous investors who believe in your revolutionary algorithm. I am your sole investor. I gave you the $5 million. Trey stepped forward, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. That is absolutely impossible. Why would you purposely fund our startup if you were secretly filing for divorce behind his back? That makes zero sense. You just handed us $5 million of free money. Thank you for the capital X, sister-in-law. I shook my head slowly, marveling at his absolute and utter ignorance. I did not give you $5 million to build a business, Trey. I gave you $5 million to prove you were running a criminal enterprise. I tapped the spacebar. The screen shifted again, this time displaying a split screen. On the left were the strict contractual terms of the seed funding agreement they had signed. On the right was a real-time ledger of their banking activities over the past 24 hours since the funds hit their account. I created those shell companies specifically to track every single illegal wire transfer you two just authorized. Trey's mouth hung open. He stared at the split screen on the television, his eyes darting between the irrefutable banking ledgers and my calm expression. The reality of the $5 million wire transfer settling into his offshore accounts, fully documented and tracked by my forensic accounting software, finally crushed his arrogant bravado. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. Before Trey could formulate an excuse, a sharp clatter of high heels shattered the quiet. Monica pushed her way through the paralyzed crowd of guests. Brandon and Trey's younger sister had spent her adult life treating my bank accounts like her personal teller machine. She marched toward the kitchen island. Monica had been listening from the hallway, absorbing the brutal truth that her brothers were trapped, and the endless river of cash was officially drying up. Her eyes were wide with panic, but her survival instinct kicked in. She defaulted to the only defense mechanism this family knew: calculated aggression. "You think you are so untouchable?" "Stella." Monica snarled, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and terror. "You think you can just cut off my brothers and kick us to the curb without consequences? You are forgetting who you are dealing with. I have a massive following online." I raised an eyebrow. "Is that right, Monica? And what exactly do you plan to do?" She reached into her designer clutch and pulled out her smartphone, gripping it tightly. "I am going to ruin you," she said. "I spent the last 3 weeks filming videos, compiling clips of you working late, looking stressed, yelling at your staff on Zoom calls. I recorded audio of you denying Brandon money. I spliced it all together with a narrative about how you are a toxic, financially abusive narcissist who held our family hostage with your wealth." Barbara gasped from the sidelines, covering her mouth, though her eyes gleamed with a vicious spark of hope. Monica held the phone up the screen, brightly displaying her social media profile. The video was already uploaded, the caption filled with damaging allegations designed to target the board of directors at my Wall Street firm. A scandal involving financial abuse and toxic family dynamics could trigger an internal ethics investigation. "I have the post queued up right now," Monica threatened. "One tap and 50,000 people see exactly what kind of monster you really are. The business press will pick it up by morning. Your firm will drop you to save their stock price. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to delete those wire transfer logs. You are going to back off Brandon and Trey, and you are going to leave our supplementary accounts untouched. If you do not agree right now, I press post and your entire career burns." She hovered her manicured thumb directly over the screen. She felt completely in control. I did not blink. I reached into my blazer pocket and retrieved my own phone. I unlocked the screen and opened my banking application. I tapped on the account management tab. "You are incredibly predictable, Monica," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "You rely on intimidation because you have zero leverage of your own. You threaten my career, ignoring the fact that my board of directors already knows every detail of this divorce and fully supports my actions. You think a fabricated sob story on the internet is going to scare a woman who dismantles fraudulent corporations for a living." I tapped the screen again, navigating to the supplementary cardholder section. Monica's name sat right at the top of the list. "What are you doing?" Monica demanded, her thumb still hovering over her screen, her fake confidence wavering. "I am cutting the dead weight," I replied simply. I tapped the large red button labeled Cancel Card immediately. Then I confirmed the action. The application processed the request in less than 2 seconds. I slid my phone back into my pocket. "Go ahead, Monica. Post the video. Tell the world how terribly I treated you while funding your entire existence. Let us see how far your internet fame gets you without my black card to pay for your data plan." For one long second, nothing happened. Monica glared at me, her mouth curled into an ugly sneer, preparing to press the button to ruin my life. Then her phone vibrated violently in her hand. A bright notification banner dropped down across the top of her screen. She glanced at it, her sneer faltering. A second later, another banner dropped down. Then a third. The phone began buzzing frantically, emitting a rapid succession of sharp electronic chimes that echoed loudly in the quiet penthouse. Monica stared at her screen, her eyes widening in absolute horror. The notifications kept coming, piling up faster than she could swipe them away. Payment declined. Mercedes-Benz Financial Services. Payment declined. Soho House membership. Payment declined. Exclusive designer rental subscription. Payment declined. Premium fitness club. No. Monica gasped, her voice barely a whisper. No, wait, that payment was supposed to clear tomorrow. My car lease. They are going to repossess my car. The phone buzzed again. Payment declined. Luxury cosmetics auto delivery. Monica shrieked a piercing sound of absolute panic. She dropped her arms, the thread of her defamatory video entirely forgotten as she frantically tapped at her screen, trying desperately to refresh her banking apps. She looked up at me, her face flushed red, tears of sheer panic welling in her eyes. You canceled my card. You canceled everything. My car payment is due today, Stella. You know I do not have cash in my personal account. I leaned against the cold marble counter, crossing my arms, as I watched her entire fabricated world burn down to the ground, right in front of her. You are a 28-year-old adult, Monica, I whispered, ensuring every single word cut deep. It is time you learned how to budget your own money. Monica stared at her dead smartphone, her manicured fingers trembling violently as the reality of her canceled luxury subscriptions washed over her. She opened her mouth to scream another insult, but before a single sound could escape her throat, the heavy mahogany double doors of the penthouse foyer swung wide open. The electronic chime of the private elevator echoed through the room, drawing the attention of every remaining guest. A young woman strutted into the entryway. She looked no older than 22, wearing an oversized designer trench coat, oversized sunglasses, and towering platform heels. She was dragging 3 massive, recognizable Louis Vuitton suitcases behind her. She pushed her sunglasses down the bridge of her nose, completely ignoring the 50 silent party guests, and locked her gaze directly on Brandon. Bear, the young woman announced, her voice high-pitched and dripping with manufactured sweetness. The doorman tried to stop me, but I told him I live here now. I brought all the luggage from my apartment just like you told me to. Barbara let out a sharp, genuine gasp, stumbling backward until her shoulder hit the refrigerator. She looked from the young woman in the doorway to her son, her eyes wide with horror. Barbara choked out, her voice trembling. Who is this child? Brandon froze. His face, already pale from the revelation of his ruined tech startup, drained of the last remaining drop of color. He raised his hands, palms facing outward, stepping frantically toward the girl. Chloe, what are you doing here? You were supposed to wait at the hotel until tomorrow. I told you I had to handle some corporate business tonight. Chloe dropped the handle of her largest suitcase. It hit the marble floor with a heavy thud. She placed her hands on her hips, pouting her lips. But you texted me that you were kicking your boring wife out today. You promised me I could have the primary closet and start redecorating the master bedroom tonight. I stepped out from behind the kitchen island, folding my arms across my chest. The sheer audacity of his timing was almost impressive. He had truly believed his forged line of credit and his fake offshore investors were going to secure his financial independence today. He had planned to drain my accounts, throw me out of my own home, and immediately move his mistress into my bed. I looked at Barbara, whose chest was heaving with panicked breaths. You always praised Brandon for working so hard on his networking trips to Miami and Las Vegas. Barbara, I said, my voice projecting clearly over the crowd. You told me I should be grateful he was out hustling. As it turns out, his grueling networking events consisted of renting private cabanas and buying vintage champagne for a 22-year-old Pilates instructor. He charged $40,000 in luxury hotel suites to my corporate card. Barbara looked at her son, searching his face for a denial, but Brandon could not even meet her eyes. His silence was a complete confession. For all of Barbara's toxic behavior, she prided herself on the sanctity of marriage. The reality of her golden child parading a mistress into a room full of their closest business associates shattered her carefully cultivated illusion of high society perfection. Chloe finally noticed me standing by the kitchen island. She looked me up and down, her eyes raking over my conservative travel suit with open disdain. You must be Stella, she sneered, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. Brandon told me all about you. He said you were a cold wage slave who never appreciated his genius. You really should go upstairs and pack your things. This is my new home now. Brandon and I are building a future together without your negative energy. I could not help but laugh. It was a genuine, effortless laugh that echoed off the tall windows. I picked up a thick manila folder resting on the edge of the kitchen counter. It was part of the messy stack of documents Brandon had violently kicked across the floor earlier. I walked slowly across the living room, navigating through the frozen party guests until I stood directly in front of Chloe. "I am not going anywhere, Chloe," I said warmly, extending the folder toward her. "But before you start picking out new paint colors for my master bedroom, you might want to review your boyfriend's actual financial portfolio. He has been selling you a very compelling fantasy, but numbers do not lie." Chloe snatched the folder from my hands, her manicured nails tapping against the paper. She flipped it open. Brandon lunged forward desperately, trying to grab the documents away from her, but Trey grabbed his brother by the collar, holding him back. Trey wanted to see exactly how deep this hole went. "What is this?" Chloe demanded, her eyes scanning the top page. "That is a forensic accounting summary of Brandon's personal debts," I explained smoothly. "He told you he was a wealthy tech entrepreneur on the verge of a massive breakthrough. The reality is that Brandon legally owns 0% of this penthouse. He has exactly $400 in his checking account. Furthermore, the $5 million seed funding he secured yesterday is frozen by federal banking regulators because I flagged the transaction as fraudulent." Chloe's blue eyes widened in pure terror as she rapidly flipped to the second printed page. "It gets worse," I continued. "Because Brandon committed wire fraud, he is personally liable for corporate penalties. Add his outstanding loans and unpaid luxury car leases. Your brilliant boyfriend is currently $7 million in debt." Chloe slowly lowered the folder. The smug smirk she wore completely dissolved. "You lied to me," Chloe screamed, her voice echoing shrilly. "You are nothing but a broke loser." She spun around, grabbed the heavy handle of her largest designer suitcase, and walked directly toward the open elevator, leaving him completely abandoned. The bronze doors of the private elevator slid shut with a definitive click, sealing Chloe and her designer luggage away from the penthouse forever. The sound echoed through the grand living room, serving as the final punctuation mark on Brandon's meticulously crafted fantasy. He stood frozen in the center of the marble floor. The remaining guests watched him with morbid curiosity and profound secondhand embarrassment. Barbara let out a soft, whimpering noise from her position against the stainless steel refrigerator. Trey stared at his younger brother, his earlier bravado extinguished by the magnitude of the financial ruin I had just laid bare. Monica was frantically tapping at her useless smartphone, trapped in her personal nightmare of declined transactions. But Brandon was a survivor in the worst sense of the word. He possessed a parasitic resilience that kicked in the second his primary host rejected him. The shock on his face lasted for exactly 10 seconds before it morphed into desperate calculation. He had lost his startup, his funding, his mistress, and his claim to my penthouse. But his eyes darted toward the kitchen island, tracking a thought process I could read with absolute clarity. He remembered his emergency reserve. Brandon shoved his hands into his pockets and whipped out his phone. His fingers were visibly trembling, slick with nervous sweat as he fumbled to unlock the screen. He turned his back, hunching over the device like a cornered animal. He muttered under his breath, a frantic stream of consciousness loud enough for the dead silent room to hear. "You are not going to leave me with nothing, Stella." He spat at the floor, swiping furiously across his screen. "You think you cornered me, but you forgot about the joint savings. $200,000 in liquid cash. I am wiring every single cent to a private account in the Bahamas, and there is absolutely nothing your lawyers can do to stop it." He tapped the screen with aggressive, punishing strikes. He was logging into the banking portal, navigating to the high-yield savings account we had opened together 3 years ago. Brandon treated it as a psychological safety net, cash he could view whenever his ventures failed. Trey stepped forward, leaning over Brandon's shoulder. "Move it," Trey urged in a whisper. "Wire it to the Cayman routing number we used for the exchange. Do it now before she calls the bank." I did not move. I did not reach for my own phone. I simply watched him from across the kitchen island, resting my hands flat against the cool marble surface. I watched his thumb press down hard on the digital transfer button. Brandon let out a sharp, victorious breath. Done. It is gone. You get nothing. He waited for the confirmation screen. He waited for the digital receipt that would guarantee his escape route. Instead, a bright red error message flashed across his display. I could see the reflection of the crimson banner in his widened eyes. Brandon blinked, shaking his head. He aggressively tapped the refresh icon. The screen reloaded. The banking dashboard materialized again, displaying the primary numbers in large, bold font. Available balance, $0.00. Brandon stared at the screen. He tapped the refresh button again. And again. He jammed his finger against the glass so hard I thought the screen would crack. $0.00. No. Brandon gasped, his voice cracking, pitching up into a panicked squeak. No, the bank is glitching. The app is down. Trey, check the app. Trey peered at the screen, his face turning an ashen shade of gray. It is not glitching, Brandon. The account is empty. The money is completely gone. Brandon whirled around to face me. His phone gripped so tightly his knuckles were stark white. What did you do? He screamed, the question spittle flying from his lips. You hacked my phone. You froze the account. Unfreeze it right now, Stella. That is marital property. You cannot legally lock me out of a joint savings account without a court order. You are absolutely correct, Brandon, I said, my voice projecting with calm, devastating authority over his hysterical shouting. I cannot legally drain a joint account without a court order, which is exactly why I waited until I had one. I walked around the kitchen island, closing the distance between us. I pulled a freshly printed document bearing the official seal of the New York State Supreme Court from the manila folder. I held the document up for him to see. The presiding judge accepts the financial declarations and restitution requests of the filing party as uncontested facts. Brandon stared at the legal seal, his chest heaving. Restitution for what? For theft, Brandon. I stepped closer, forcing him to look me directly in the eyes. The forensic report I submitted detailed exactly how much money you siphoned from my accounts over 5 years. Every wire transfer to your failing businesses, every extravagant dinner you charged to my cards, every luxury hotel suite you booked for Chloe, every single dollar you funneled to Trey to keep his fake lifestyle afloat. Barbara let out another choked gasp, sinking lower against the refrigerator. The grand total came to exactly $200,000. I stated, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. The judge agreed that you had committed financial dissipation of marital assets. As part of the final legally binding divorce decree, I was granted exclusive ownership of the entire joint savings balance as direct restitution. The bank executed the court order at 9 o'clock this morning. I did not freeze the account, Brandon. I legally withdrew every single cent of that money. You have absolutely nothing left now. The heavy silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. Brandon stared blankly at his phone screen, his thumb hovering uselessly over the zero balance. His chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in midair, waiting for gravity to pull him down. Trey broke the spell. He let out a harsh, dismissive scoff and shoved his younger brother aside. He rolled his shoulders, attempting to salvage whatever scraps of dignity remained in the room. You are panicking over pocket change, Brandon Trey snapped, adjusting his expensive silk tie. Let her keep her little $200,000. Let her have her pathetic restitution. It is irrelevant. We do not need her joint account savings. We have operational capital. We have the crypto reserves we built up over the last 6 months. We are completely independent of her money. Trey pulled his custom-engraved smartphone from his inner jacket pocket. He looked at me with a sickeningly arrogant sneer. You really thought you could destroy us by freezing a fiat currency account? You clearly do not understand the blockchain, Stella. We hold our assets in decentralized wallets, untraceable, untouchable, and completely out of the jurisdiction of your little state divorce court. I am going to transfer $100,000 into a clean account right now just to watch you cry. He tapped the screen of his phone, loading the highly secure application that housed their primary digital assets. Barbara watched him with bated breath, her hands clasped tightly together as if praying to a new digital deity. Even Brandon looked up, a glimmer of desperate hope returning to his bloodshot eyes. Trey was the older brother, the supposed financial mastermind who always had a backup plan. Trey navigated the security protocols, typing in his complex passwords and executing the facial recognition scan. The loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the marble counter, watching the exact moment his world imploded. The application interface did not load. Instead, the entire screen flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson red. A bold, solid white banner locked the screen. The text was stark and unmistakable. Trey squinted, his brow furrowing as he tried to comprehend the message blocking his access. Account frozen by federal authorities. Asset seizure protocol initiated. Please contact your legal representative. Trey tapped the screen. He tapped it again, harder this time. Nothing happened. The red screen remained locked, glaring back at him like a stop sign. "What is this?" Trey muttered, his voice dropping an octave. He backed out of the app and restarted his phone, his hands moving with frantic, jerky motions. Brandon stepped closer, his eyes darting between his brother and the glowing red screen. "What does it say, Trey? Why is it red?" Trey ignored him, relaunching the application. The same crimson screen appeared instantly. Account frozen by federal authorities. I smiled, pouring myself another splash of sparkling water from the glass pitcher on the island. I took a slow sip before addressing the room. "I told you, Trey, I am a senior director of mergers and acquisitions. My entire professional existence revolves around identifying corporate fraud, assessing financial risk, and ensuring strict regulatory compliance. You assumed I was just setting up a trap for a divorce settlement. You thought too small. I did not just track your fake startup using my offshore shell company. I built a comprehensive, undeniable portfolio of your criminal activities." Trey lowered his phone slowly, his eyes locked on mine. "What did you do?" "I did what any responsible financial expert would do when they uncover a massive scam," I replied smoothly. "I compiled every single wire transfer, every fabricated investor pitch deck, every fraudulent capitalization table, and every false promise you made to retail investors. Then I handed that entire neatly organized portfolio directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission." Barbara let out a high-pitched wail, her knees finally giving out. She collapsed onto one of the velvet dining chairs, burying her face in her hands. "The SEC," Brandon whispered, the color draining from his face yet again. "You called the feds on us." "I did not just call them, Brandon. I provided them with a roadmap." I corrected him. "You and your brother have been soliciting millions of dollars for an unregistered security. You operated a decentralized exchange without adhering to a single anti-money laundering protocol. You engaged in blatant, undeniable wire fraud across international borders. The federal authorities do not take those infractions lightly. That red screen on Trey's phone means the Department of Justice has officially seized your digital assets. They have frozen your wallets, your exchange accounts, and your domestic bank accounts." Trey was hyperventilating now. His chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow bursts. He looked at his phone, then at me, then at the floor. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization of his impending reality. "Federal authorities, wire fraud." He muttered the words, as if tasting them for the first time. "Those are federal felonies, Stella. They carry mandatory minimum sentences." "Yes, they do," I agreed cheerfully, "up to 20 years in federal prison per count. And given the amount of capital you tried to launder through my Cayman shell company, you are looking at multiple counts. You are not just facing a messy divorce, boys, you are facing a federal indictment." Trey stood completely still for 3 seconds. The silence in the penthouse was broken only by Barbara's muffled sobbing. Then the realization of what had actually happened finally connected in Trey's mind. He had not built this operation alone. He had followed his brother's lead. Trey turned slowly to face Brandon. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a sudden, violent rage. "You idiot, Trey!" hissed his voice, vibrating with venom. You absolute arrogant idiot. Brandon took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. Trey, wait. We can hire lawyers. We can fight this. We just need to figure out a defense strategy. Fight this! Trey roared, the sound echoing off the glass walls. Fight the federal government. With what money, Brandon? Your accounts are empty. My accounts are frozen. We are completely broke. You dragged me into this. You promised me this algorithm was bulletproof. You swore she was just a clueless corporate drone who would never figure it out. Before Brandon could formulate a response, Trey lunged forward. He grabbed Brandon by the lapels of his custom shirt, twisting the fabric tightly in his massive fists. He slammed Brandon backward against the expensive plaster wall, rattling the framed artwork hanging nearby. Trey, stop! Brandon choked out, clawing frantically at his brother's wrists. You ruined my life, Trey screamed, shaking Brandon violently. You dragged me into a federal crime. I am going to go to prison because of you. I am going to lose everything because you could not keep your financial mess contained. Barbara scrambled up from her chair, rushing toward her sons. Boys, stop it. Please stop fighting. I watched the two brothers tear each other apart with absolute satisfaction. They were no longer the arrogant, untouchable visionaries they had pretended to be just 10 minutes ago. They were nothing but common criminals trapped in a cage of their own making, turning on each other the second survival became impossible. Trey pulled back his fist, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury, ready to strike the brother he had idolized only moments before. The illusion of family loyalty evaporated. The empire they had tried to build on my back had crumbled, crushing them entirely. The sound of tearing fabric and grunts filled the penthouse as Trey shoved Brandon against the kitchen island. Brandon scrambled backward, slipping on polished marble, his hands desperately swatting at his older brother. The remaining party guests backed away, paralyzed by the unfolding disaster and wanting no part of the federal crime implosion. Barbara could not bear it. The sight of her golden child being physically assaulted, combined with the catastrophic realization that their financial empire was a complete illusion, broke something deep within her meticulously maintained psyche. She pushed herself off the refrigerator, her hands trembling. She did not intervene to break up the fight. Instead, her eyes locked onto me, filled with sudden venomous clarity. In her twisted reality, I was not the victim who had just protected her own assets. I was the villain who maliciously destroyed her family. She pulled her phone from her designer handbag with frantic movements. Her thumb jabbed at the screen. I watched her press 3 digits, 911. She pressed the phone to her ear, her face contorting into a mask of manufactured terror. The transformation was instantaneous. "Help us!" Barbara shrieked into the receiver, her voice pitched perfectly to convey genuine life-threatening panic. "Please, you have to send someone immediately. We are at the Waverly penthouse. There is a violent intruder in our home." She broke in. "She is attacking my sons. She is threatening us. Please, she is deranged. I think she has a weapon. Hurry." She dropped the phone, letting it clatter onto the counter, and backed into the corner, wrapping her arms around herself. She began to hyperventilate, squeezing her eyes shut and forcing tears down her powdered cheeks. It was a masterclass in manipulation, a desperate gamble to regain control by weaponizing the authorities against me. Brandon and Trey stopped fighting, both freezing as they realized what their mother had done. Trey released his grip on Brandon's collar, stepping back, his chest heaving. He looked from his mother to me, a flicker of genuine dread crossing his face. Involving the police while actively facing federal wire fraud charges was the absolute worst tactical move. But Barbara was not thinking about the Securities and Exchange Commission. She was only thinking about punishing me. "You are insane, Mother," Trey hissed, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You do not call the cops when we are compromised. She attacked us." Barbara wailed, maintaining her performance for the remaining guests, establishing her narrative. "She broke in and assaulted my family." I stood perfectly still, my hands resting lightly on the manila folder. I did not attempt to flee. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I simply waited. The Waverly was a high-profile building. A reported violent home invasion guaranteed an immediate, overwhelming response. Less than 4 minutes later, the heavy mahogany double doors burst open. 4 New York Police Department officers surged into the entryway, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts, their eyes scanning the expansive room for immediate threats. Barbara immediately threw herself forward, stumbling across the floor and collapsing into the arms of the lead officer. "Thank God you are here," she sobbed, clutching his uniform. "That is her." She pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. "She forced her way into our private residence. She has been screaming, threatening my boys, destroying our property. Get her out of here. She is a danger to all of us. Please arrest her." The lead officer, a stern man with a thick mustache, gently moved Barbara behind him. 2 other officers flanked him, their expressions hardening as they focused on me. They saw a calm woman standing behind a kitchen island, but the call demanded strict protocol. "Ma'am, keep your hands where we can see them," the lead officer commanded, his voice echoing loudly. "Step out from behind the counter." I complied instantly, raising my hands, palms outward, moving smoothly into the center of the kitchen area. "I am completely unarmed." "Officer," I stated clearly, keeping my tone respectful and devoid of any panic. "I am the sole legal owner of this property. You are responding to a false report." "That is a lie," Barbara shrieked from behind the uniform. "She is my daughter-in-law. She does not own this penthouse. My son owns it. She is trespassing and violently refusing to leave. She assaulted my sons. Look at them." She gestured wildly toward Brandon, whose shirt collar was torn from his fight with Trey. The officer glanced at Brandon, noting the disheveled clothing, then returned his focus to me. "We received a call about a violent intruder with a potential weapon." "I understand you have to follow protocol," I said, maintaining eye contact with the lead officer. "But you have been weaponized in a domestic financial dispute. If you look at the counter to my left, you will see a manila folder. It contains every piece of identification and legal documentation you need to verify exactly who I am and who legally belongs in this residence." The officer hesitated, assessing my calm demeanor against Barbara's hysterical sobbing. He nodded to his partner, who cautiously approached the counter and retrieved the thick folder. The second officer flipped it open, scanning the top page. "First, you will find my state-issued identification matching the name on the property records," I narrated smoothly as the officer sifted through the papers. "Behind that is the certified notarized deed to this penthouse executed 3 years ago, listing my name exclusively. Behind that is the documentation for the irrevocable trust that financed the purchase. Finally, you will find the default divorce decree granted by the Supreme Court. It grants me exclusive use of this marital residence and legally mandates that Brandon must immediately vacate the premises." The lead officer read the judicial stamp and verified the signatures. The police officers instantly relaxed. They turned slowly to look at Barbara, realizing she filed a false police report. The lead officer handed the thick manila folder back to me with a respectful nod. The tension in his shoulders dropped, but his gaze facing Barbara was absolutely ice-cold. He hooked his thumbs into his heavy leather duty belt, stepping toward the 2 brothers who were now completely frozen in panic. "Madame, filing a false report is a misdemeanor in New York," the officer stated, his voice ringing with authority. "You called emergency services claiming a violent home invasion. What I see right here is a legitimate property owner standing peacefully in her kitchen, and people who are legally mandated to vacate." Barbara opened her mouth to argue, but the officer raised a stern hand, silencing her instantly. He shifted his attention to Brandon, whose pale face made him look entirely pathetic. "Mr. Preston, I have reviewed the Supreme Court decree," the officer continued. "The judge has officially granted your former wife exclusive occupancy of this residence. That means you no longer have a legal right to be here. Given the blatant false report your mother just filed, I am not in a generous mood." Brandon swallowed hard, holding his trembling hands up defensively. "Officer, all my belongings are still here. I just need time." "You have exactly 24 hours, the lead officer interrupted, stepping into Brandon's personal space. "The clock starts right now. If I get a single call from Ms. Preston tomorrow evening and anyone related to you is still standing inside this penthouse, you will all be immediately arrested and charged with criminal trespassing. Do you understand me?" Brandon nodded rapidly, his voice failing him. "Good," the officer said. He looked over the ruined family, his disgust evident. 24 hours. Pack your things and get out." Without another word, the 4 officers turned and marched out. The mahogany double doors shut behind them, the heavy thud sealing the fate of the Preston family. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. It was the kind of deafening quiet that follows a catastrophic explosion, where dust is still settling and survivors are just realizing the devastation. I remained standing perfectly calm behind the massive kitchen island, resting my hands on the cool marble. The remaining party guests who stayed to watch the spectacle unfold realized the show was over, and the reality of federal crimes was too radioactive. They grabbed their coats in silence and sprinted for the elevator. Within 2 minutes, the living room was emptied of outsiders. Only the family remained. The carefully constructed facade of high society perfection had been entirely stripped away. There was no more polite passive aggression or thinly veiled insults. There was only raw survival instinct, and in the Preston family, survival meant tearing each other apart to save themselves. Barbara was the first to snap. The woman who spent years cultivating an image of serene, aristocratic grace suddenly transformed into a cornered, vicious animal. She lunged forward, not toward me, but toward Brandon. She shoved him hard in the chest. "You absolute fool!" Barbara screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet room. "You lost her. You lost the penthouse. You lost the funding. You had a golden ticket, Brandon. A brilliant, wealthy woman who funded your lifestyle, and you threw it all away for a 22-year-old Pilates instructor." Brandon stumbled backward, shocked by his mother's physical assault. "Mom, stop. I was trying to build my own empire. I was trying to make us independent." "Independent?" Barbara shrieked. Her face flushed dark red with fury. "You have never been independent. You lived off her credit cards. She was your meal ticket, and you let arrogance blind you. The federal government is going to seize Trey's accounts. You ruined us because you could not keep your pants zipped." Brandon looked around wildly, seeking an ally, but he was entirely alone. "I can fix this," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I just need a bridge loan. I can talk to investors." "What investors?" Barbara laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound. "You are a fraud, Brandon. She proved it. The whole world is going to know by tomorrow morning." While Barbara verbally dismantled her youngest son, Monica finally found her voice. She stared at her dead smartphone, then her fury shifted to the man standing next to her. She threw the useless device directly at Trey's chest. It hit him with a sharp thwack and clattered to the floor. "A federal crime!" Trey, Monica shrieked, her manicured fingers curling into claws. "You involved us in a federal wire fraud scam. I thought you were a legitimate venture capitalist. I thought we were building generational wealth." Trey backed away from his wife, his hands raised defensively. "Monica, calm down. The SEC is just doing a preliminary inquiry. I can hire defense attorneys. I can shelter our primary assets." "With what money?" Monica screamed, jabbing a finger against his sternum. "Your accounts are frozen. My credit cards are declining. You lied to me. You promised me a lifestyle in the Hamptons, and instead, you dragged me into a federal indictment. My family will disown me when they find out I am married to a federal criminal. I was doing it for us." Trey yelled back, his own panic fueling his anger. "I was trying to keep you in the designer clothes and luxury cars you demand every single month." The penthouse devolved into absolute chaos. Barbara continued to berate Brandon, slapping his hands away as he tried to calm her down. Monica backed Trey into the hallway, screaming about lawyers. They were so consumed by their own destruction, they completely forgot I was there. I turned around and opened the commercial-grade refrigerator. I reached past expensive imported waters and pulled out a chilled bottle of vintage champagne. I popped the cork with a satisfying echo and poured myself a generous glass. I leaned against the kitchen counter, took a slow, highly satisfying sip of champagne, and simply watched the entire empire crumble. The morning sun reflected off the glass facades of the financial district, casting sharp geometric shadows across my pristine mahogany desk. I sat in my corner office on the 42nd floor, sipping black coffee and reviewing quarterly acquisition spreadsheets for our European division. The ambient hum of Wall Street below was a comforting contrast to the pathetic unraveling of the Preston family I had witnessed the night before. Leaving the penthouse, I had checked into the Four Seasons knowing the eviction deadline would expire by evening. My focus was back on my career, untouched by Brandon's parasitic reach. My concentration was interrupted by a sudden commotion filtering through the frosted glass walls. The polished tranquility of the executive floor shattered as raised male voices echoed down the corridor. My private receptionist, Sarah, let out a sharp gasp of protest. I did not need to look at the security monitors to know who had breached the perimeter. Desperation has a very distinct chaotic frequency. The heavy glass door to my office violently swung open, slamming against the rubber doorstop. Brandon and Trey barged into the room, their chests heaving, their faces flushed with a toxic cocktail of panic and rage. They looked entirely out of place in the sterile, high-powered environment. Brandon wore the same wrinkled dress shirt from last night, sweat stains blooming under his arms. Trey had lost his designer tie, his eyes bloodshot from a sleepless night, spent staring down a federal indictment. Sarah appeared behind them, her hand hovering over her earpiece. "I am so sorry, Stella," she said, her voice tight with alarm. They pushed right past the security desk in the lobby. "I am calling the guards right now. That will not be necessary just yet." "Sarah," I replied smoothly, my eyes never leaving the illuminated cells of my spreadsheet. "Close the door behind them, please." Sarah hesitated, then complied, sealing the two desperate men inside my domain. Brandon marched directly to my desk, slamming his palms flat against the polished wood. "Look at me when I am speaking to you," he demanded, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "You think you can just orchestrate a federal investigation, throw my mother onto the street, and walk away to your little corporate tower? You are going to call off the SEC, Stella. You are going to sign over the joint funds and drop this entire eviction charade right now." I kept my gaze fixed on my monitors. I highlighted a row of revenue projections, hit copy, and pasted it into a new column. The click of my mouse was the only sound in the room for 5 agonizing seconds. "Did you hear me?" Brandon screamed, striking the desk with a closed fist. "You owe me, Stella. I made you. I spent the first 3 years of our marriage taking you to every networking gala in Manhattan. I introduced you to the senior partners at this firm. I stood by you while you worked 80-hour weeks and ignored your duties as a wife. I built your confidence. I built your network. You are sitting in this chair because I allowed you the space to chase your little career while I was out hustling for our future. You are nothing without my connections." Trey stepped up beside him, adopting a falsely diplomatic tone. "Stella, be reasonable. You proved your point. You showed us you have teeth. But if you let this federal inquiry proceed, you are going to destroy lives. Monica is threatening to leave me. My mother is having a nervous breakdown in an empty apartment. Just withdraw the fraud complaint, and we will sign whatever divorce papers you want. We can negotiate a clean break." I tapped the enter key, finalized the formula, and finally shifted my gaze away from the screens. I looked at Brandon first, assessing his disheveled state with clinical detachment. "You did not build my network, Brandon," I said, my voice cold and precise. "You drank free scotch at my corporate events and pitched your doomed ventures to my colleagues until human resources asked me to stop bringing you. You did not give me space to work. You drained my accounts to fund a lifestyle you could not afford, forcing me to work those 80-hour weeks just to keep us from drowning in your debt. You are a financial parasite, and you have finally run out of hosts." Brandon's face contorted in fury. He lunged around the side of the desk, reaching out to grab my shoulders and force me to comply. "You ungrateful, arrogant little—" He never finished the sentence. I casually moved my right hand to the underside of my desk and pressed the silent biometric security button. Desperate men with no resources always resort to physical intimidation when their manipulation fails. Before Brandon could take another step toward me, the side door of my office, a discreet entrance connecting directly to the internal security hub, burst open. 6 heavily armed corporate security contractors flooded into the room. These were not the lobby receptionists. They were former tactical law enforcement officers, highly trained, heavily vetted, and explicitly briefed on the threat profile of the 2 men currently threatening a senior director. They moved with terrifying speed and precision. Two guards instantly flanked Brandon, grabbing his arms and forcing him backward away from my desk. He yelled out in surprise, struggling against their iron grips, but they locked him into a submission hold that immobilized him completely. Two more guards pinned Trey against the frosted glass wall, ignoring his frantic protests about being a wealthy venture capitalist. "Get your hands off me!" Trey shouted, his cheek pressed flat against the glass. "You cannot do this! We are here to negotiate a family matter. Let me go right now." I stood up and smoothed my tailored skirt. "You just committed a documented threat. My legal team will secure a permanent restraining order. Escort them off the premises right now." The adrenaline from the morning office invasion had barely subsided by the time I descended into the subterranean executive parking garage. My heels echoed sharply against the cold concrete as I approached my reserved spot. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. Before the headlights could even flash, a shadow detached itself from the concrete pillar beside my car. I stopped my hand instinctively, dropping to the heavy canister of pepper spray in my coat pocket. It was Barbara. The matriarch of the Preston family looked entirely unrecognizable. Her signature blonde blowout was flattened and stringy, her expensive designer coat wrinkled, as if she had slept in it, and her eyes were puffy and red-rimmed. She had clearly been waiting in the damp garage for hours, shivering in the dimly lit corner. The arrogance that usually radiated from her was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, desperate panic. "Stella, please wait," Barbara pleaded, her voice cracking as she took a hesitant step forward. Her hands were clasped tightly together, shaking uncontrollably. "I know I am the last person you want to see right now, but I have nowhere else to go." I kept my distance, my grip tightening on my keys. "You are violating the perimeter of my workplace, Barbara. After your sons attempted to assault me upstairs, you are incredibly lucky I do not call my security team down here right now." She let out a pathetic sob, dropping to her knees on the filthy concrete floor. The sight of this woman who had tormented me for years, kneeling in the oil stains of a parking garage, was jarring. "I am begging you, Stella. I need a loan. Just a short-term bridge loan. You have millions now. I saw the documents at the penthouse. You can spare it. I need to save my house. The bank is initiating foreclosure proceedings tomorrow morning." I stared down at her, processing the sheer audacity of her request. "Your house is fully paid off, Barbara. Brandon bragged about that family estate constantly. It has been in the Preston family for 3 generations. Barbara shook her head frantically, wiping snot and tears from her face. "It was paid off. But Brandon needed capital. He needed seed money for his venture fund when the traditional banks turned him down. He swore it was a guaranteed return. I took out a massive reverse mortgage on the estate to fund his lifestyle and his fake algorithms. I leveraged everything to give him the image he needed to succeed. Now the accounts are frozen by the federal government, the payments have bounced for 3 months, and the bank is taking the property. I will be homeless by the end of the week." I stood in the cold garage, absorbing the absolute poetic justice of her confession. She had mortgaged her own generational wealth to fund the very scam I had just reported to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I did not feel pity for her. Instead, I felt a deep, profound satisfaction. I walked past her kneeling figure, opened the trunk of my car, and retrieved my leather briefcase. I placed it on the hood of my vehicle and snapped the brass locks open. I sifted through the neatly organized compartments and pulled out a thick, red-banded financial dossier. I walked over to Barbara and dropped the heavy folder directly onto the concrete in front of her knees. "Open it," I commanded. Barbara flinched, then reached out with trembling fingers to pull back the heavy cover. She stared at the top sheet, her bloodshot eyes scanning the complex legal jargon. Her breath hitched. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the garage ventilation. "It is a distressed asset portfolio." I explained, my tone perfectly even. As a senior director of mergers and acquisitions, part of my professional mandate is identifying undervalued or distressed debt bundles and acquiring them for our firm to restructure. 2 weeks ago, my firm finalized the purchase of a massive portfolio of defaulted reverse mortgages from your original lender. I personally oversaw the acquisition and the transfer of the underlying assets. I pointed a perfectly manicured finger at the document. If you look at page 4, section B, you will see your home address listed. I did not just freeze your sons out of their fake empire, Barbara. My firm literally owns the debt on your estate. I hold the paper that dictates your eviction. Barbara stared up at me, her face pale, her jaw slack with absolute horror. You planned all of this, she gasped. You bought my debt just to destroy me. I bought it because it was highly profitable, I corrected. Ruining you is just a bonus. Please, Stella, she begged, grabbing my coat. You have to stop the foreclosure. Give me a loan. You cannot throw me out. A sharp memory surged to the surface. 5 years ago, I stood in her foyer, sobbing. My mother needed experimental cancer treatment our insurance denied. I begged them for a loan. I stepped back now, pulling my expensive coat from her desperate grip. I looked her dead in the eye and let the past echo through the garage. We do not have that kind of money lying around for lost causes, Stella, I recited, keeping my voice chillingly precise. You need to be realistic about this situation. It is not my family's responsibility to drain our assets just because your bloodline cannot afford to survive. Barbara let out a choked gasp, recognizing her exact cruel words from 5 years ago. The color completely drained from her face as the weight of her past malice crushed her. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase, turned my back on her pathetic kneeling form, and finally got into my car. I started the powerful engine, the bright headlights illuminating her entirely shattered figure, and slowly drove away, leaving her completely alone in the freezing concrete dark. The drive from the subterranean parking garage to the Four Seasons took less than 10 minutes, but the shift in atmosphere was absolute. I left Barbara shivering in the concrete darkness of her own financial ruin and stepped into the hushed, lavender-scented lobby of the hotel. My pulse was steady. The adrenaline of the evening had smoothed into a cold, calculated focus. The 24-hour eviction clock was ticking. I was not about to leave the dismantling of the Preston Empire unmonitored. Once inside my suite, I discarded my coat, poured a glass of sparkling water, and opened my laptop on the glass desk. I logged into the Waverly Penthouse security network. When I purchased the property, I installed a state-of-the-art, discreet 4K surveillance system. Brandon never noticed the microscopic lenses embedded in the crown molding. He was too busy admiring his own reflection to look closely at the architecture. The screen populated with a grid of live feeds. The penthouse was a scene of pathetic, frantic chaos. Trey and Brandon were violently throwing custom suits and expensive shoes into black trash bags in the guest suites. They looked like looters ransacking a sinking ship. There was no sign of Barbara yet. She was likely still sobbing in the garage or wandering the streets, unable to face the reality of her impending homelessness. My eyes flicked to the camera covering the master suite. The heavy oak doors were closed, but the feed inside my private dressing room showed movement. It was Monica. Trey's wife was not packing her own belongings. She was creeping through my closet, her eyes darting nervously toward the doorway. Monica had always coveted my wardrobe. During family dinners, she would make snide, passive-aggressive remarks about how I wasted my money on frivolous accessories instead of supporting my husband's visionary investments. Now the supposedly wealthy venture capitalist's wife was reduced to a common thief. I watched in high definition as Monica bypassed the clothing racks and moved directly toward my velvet jewelry displays. Her manicured fingers trembled as she slid open the top drawer. She bypassed the diamond earrings and went straight for the most liquid assets I owned. She snatched 3 Cartier watches, a rose gold Ballon Bleu, a diamond-encrusted tank, and a vintage Santos, and shoved them aggressively into the depths of her oversized Birkin bag. She snapped the bag shut, smoothed her hair, and took a deep breath, transforming her face back into a mask of arrogant entitlement. She thought she had just secured her severance package. She thought she was outsmarting the system. I slammed my laptop shut, grabbed my keys, and walked out of the suite. The Waverly was only 3 blocks away. I bypassed the doorman with a brisk nod and stepped into the private elevator. I swiped my key fob, granting me direct access to the penthouse foyer. The doors slid open silently. I stepped out just as Monica was tiptoeing down the main corridor, clutching her Birkin bag tightly against her chest. She was making a beeline for the exit, hoping to slip away, while her husband and brother-in-law were distracted by their own packing. "Going somewhere?" "Monica," I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet foyer like a cracking whip. Monica jumped, letting out a sharp gasp. She spun around, her eyes wide with shock. Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the handles of her bag. "Stella, what are you doing here? The police said we had 24 hours to pack our things." "You have 24 hours to pack your things," I corrected, stepping slowly toward her. "You do not have 24 hours to pack my things." "I do not know what you are talking about," Monica stammered, lifting her chin in a pathetic attempt to regain her usual haughty demeanor. "I am just leaving. Trey and I are done. I am going to stay with my parents in Southampton until my divorce lawyers figure out how to extract me from this nightmare. Now get out of my way." She tried to step around me, but I shifted, blocking the elevator doors entirely. "Empty the bag, Monica," I demanded, my tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Excuse me, how dare you?" she shrieked, clutching the leather bag tighter. "You have no right to speak to me that way. You are a bitter, vindictive woman who destroyed this family. I'm not showing you anything." "You destroyed yourselves," I replied smoothly. "You spent the last 3 years drinking my champagne and mocking my career choices, pretending your husband was a Wall Street titan while he was actually running a glorified Ponzi scheme. You looked down on me because I actually worked for my wealth, and now the second the illusion shatters, you resort to stealing. Empty the bag." "I am calling the police," Monica threatened, pulling her phone from her pocket with shaking hands. I smiled, pulling my own phone from my blazer. I tapped the screen and held it up. The brilliant 4K resolution displayed a crystal-clear video of Monica sliding the 3 Cartier watches into her bag just 10 minutes earlier. "Call them," I offered cheerfully. "The police were just here. I am sure they would love to return to process a grand larceny charge. Those 3 watches are valued at over $75,000. In New York, that is a Class C felony. You will face up to 15 years in a state penitentiary. Your parents in Southampton will be absolutely thrilled to read about their daughter's felony arrest in the morning papers." Monica stared at the video playing on my screen. The blood drained completely from her face. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. The arrogant facade shattered, leaving only raw, humiliating terror. She knew she was trapped. "Dump it," I commanded, pointing to the polished marble floor. "Right now." Tears welled in Monica's eyes, spilling over her mascara. With trembling hands, she unclasped the Birkin bag. She turned it upside down and shook it. Lip gloss, a wallet, sunglasses, and 3 heavy Cartier watches clattered violently onto the hard marble floor. I looked down at the stolen property, then back up at her tear-stained face. I pointed to the glowing red recording light on the ceiling security camera directly above us. "I have you on camera stealing them, and I have you on camera returning them," I said coldly. "If you ever come near me, my property, or my assets again, I will hand this footage directly to the district attorney. Now get out of my building." Monica let out a humiliated sob. She scrambled over the watches, grabbed her empty bag, and practically threw herself into the elevator. She smashed the lobby button with her fist, keeping her face averted, as the heavy metal doors finally slid shut, erasing her from my life entirely. The remaining hours of the 24-hour eviction window ticked away with agonizing slowness. Sunlight streamed through the massive windows, illuminating a scene of utter defeat. The grand illusion of wealth had been replaced by the harsh reality of black trash bags and cardboard boxes scattered across the pristine marble floors. Brandon and Trey moved in sullen silence, haphazardly stuffing suits, shoes, and luxury items into the bags. The heavy silence was broken only by the sound of packing tape ripping and the occasional muffled sob from Barbara, who sat curled in a velvet armchair staring blankly at the wall. Trey angrily shoved a stack of silk ties into a cardboard box. He paused, wiping cold sweat from his pale forehead. His eyes darted nervously toward the penthouse entrance, then back to his younger brother. Brandon was methodically wrapping his collection of imported watches in tissue paper, completely oblivious to the imminent danger they now faced. Trey scoffed loudly. "You are packing watches," Trey muttered, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage. "We are facing a federal indictment and you are worried about shiny accessories." Brandon did not look up from his task. "We need capital, Trey. We can pawn these to hire good defense counsel." Stella froze everything. "This is all we have left now anyway." Before Trey could respond, a thunderous crash echoed from the foyer as the heavy mahogany double doors were violently breached by absolute brute force. "Federal agents, get your hands high up in the air. Keep them where we can see them right now." A tide of men and women wearing tactical gear and windbreakers reading FBI flooded into the expansive living room, paralyzing everyone inside with their commanding presence. There was no time to react, no time to hide, and absolutely no time to destroy any crucial digital evidence. Brandon dropped a watch, shattering the glass. He raised his hands instantly, his knees buckling as a heavily armed agent moved directly toward him. Trey backed away from his packing boxes, hitting the kitchen island, his hands trembling in the air. Barbara let out a piercing shriek, clutching her chest as two agents flanked her velvet chair, commanding her to remain seated. A tall man in a dark suit stepped through the broken doorway, holding a thick stack of papers. His badge swung from a lanyard around his neck. He surveyed the chaotic scene with cold, clinical detachment. Brandon Preston and Trey Preston, the lead agent, announced, his voice carrying absolute authority. "We are executing a federal search and seizure warrant here today. You are under investigation for multiple counts of wire fraud, securities fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." Brandon tried to speak, but the words died in his throat. He looked at Trey, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading terror. Trey refused to meet his gaze, staring instead at the cold marble floor. The lead agent gestured to his team. "Secure all electronics." The penthouse immediately transformed into a crime scene. Agents moved with ruthless efficiency. They were hunting for the digital evidence. One agent moved directly to the media console, yanking out the concealed network servers. Another team breached the home office. I had mapped out the exact locations of their hardware when I handed my portfolio to the authorities. The agents knew exactly where to look first. Two agents emerged from the office carrying Trey's encrypted laptops, the hard drives safely secured in evidence bags. Another agent marched into the living room holding Brandon's desktop tower and a stack of external hard drives found upstairs. Trey watched the agents catalog his laptops, his chest rising and falling in bursts. The wallets holding their capital, the pitch decks, the capitalization tables. It was all in those bags. His digital fortress was now in federal custody. The reality of federal prison and the destruction of his life crashed down upon him. His loyalty to his brother evaporated, replaced by a desperate need for self-preservation. Trey lunged forward, breaking his frozen stance, pointing a finger directly at Brandon. "I did not do this!" Trey shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "It was all him. He is the mastermind. I am just the technical guy. He brought me the investors. He told me to build the platform. He swore the algorithm was legitimate. I just wrote the code he asked me to write." Brandon stared at his older brother, his face draining of all color. "Trey, what are you doing?" "Shut up. You are talking to the feds. I am not going to prison for you," Trey screamed, turning to the lead federal agent. "I have emails and text messages. I kept all the communications." He directed the transfer of funds. He instructed me on how to hide the currency conversions. "I will give you the decryption keys. I will give you everything you need." He lied to everyone. I was following his orders. Barbara sobbed uncontrollably from the armchair, watching her sons turn on each other like cornered rats. Brandon shook his head, stepping toward Trey, his hands balling into fists. "You coward!" "Brandon," hissed, his voice vibrating with venom. "You built the wallets. You designed the entire laundering mechanism. You were taking a 50% cut. You are just as guilty as I am." The lead federal agent watched the brothers tear each other apart in front of him. He nodded to the officers standing around the room. "You can explain the details to the prosecutors downtown," the agent stated calmly. "Secure the suspects immediately." The agents moved in, pulling their arms behind their backs. The click of handcuffs was the final sound of the Preston empire collapsing. Brandon struggled, his face contorted in a mask of fury, glaring at his brother. Trey stood limp, tears streaming down his pale cheeks as cold steel locked around his wrists. They were no longer untouchable visionaries they claimed to be. They were criminals broken, exposed, and heading to federal custody. I watched the polished elevator doors slide shut, sealing the federal agents and my former family inside. The penthouse, once a monument to their unchecked arrogance, was now a silent, ransacked tomb. I did not linger. There was no victory in staring at empty marble floors. I turned on my heel, walked out through the private service exit, and signaled my driver. It was time to shift the battlefield from my property to the federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan. My lead counsel, Diana, operated out of a corner office overlooking Foley Square. She was a former federal prosecutor herself, a woman who treated corporate litigation like a blood sport. When I walked into her office, she was already pacing behind her desk, a sleek wireless headset tucked into her ear. She held up a single finger, signaling me to wait, a sharp smile playing on her lips. She tapped her headset to end the call and turned to me, her eyes gleaming with predatory satisfaction. "They are singing," Diana announced, dropping into her leather chair and gesturing for me to sit. "They have been in federal custody for less than 2 hours, and they are already tearing each other to pieces." I settled into the chair, crossing my legs. "Barbara always preached that the Preston family bond was impenetrable," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "She claimed blood loyalty would always conquer external threats." Diana let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "Blood loyalty evaporates the second a federal prosecutor places a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence on the table. They are in separate interrogation rooms at the Jacob Javits Federal Building right now. Both of them immediately waived their right to counsel. They are terrified. They both think whoever flips first gets the immunity deal. My contacts inside the U.S. Attorney Office are texting me the live updates." Diana picked up her tablet, swiping awake the screen. "Let us start with Trey Preston. He is currently in room 4, weeping. He has entirely abandoned the stoic venture capitalist persona. He is painting himself as a naive software developer who was manipulated by a charismatic sociopath. He just handed the feds the decryption keys to a hidden offshore server." I leaned forward, my interest piqued. "What is on the server?" "Everything," Diana replied, reading directly from the encrypted messages. "Trey claims Brandon forced him to create the phantom wallets to artificially inflate the user metrics. Trey told the agents he begged Brandon to stop, but Brandon threatened to ruin his career if he did not comply. Trey just gave them a detailed ledger of every single wire fraud transaction, explicitly highlighting where Brandon signed off on the transfers. He is trying to pin the entire criminal enterprise on his brother, claiming he was merely an employee, following strict directives from his CEO." I nodded slowly. Trey always hid behind his shadow. It makes perfect sense he would try to use that same shadow to hide from a federal indictment. "What about my former husband? How is Brandon handling the pressure?" Diana swiped to the next screen, her smile widening. "Brandon is in room 7, and he is utilizing a completely different strategy. He is playing the victim of technological ignorance. He is telling the feds that he was just the visionary, the face of the company. He claims he does not even know how to write a line of code and trusted his older brother to handle the financial architecture." "That is a bold strategy," I noted. Brandon loved to brag about his technical prowess at cocktail parties. "He is backtracking entirely now," Diana said. "Brandon is throwing Trey straight into the fire." He told the agents that Trey secretly skimmed millions from the seed capital to fund his own private offshore accounts. Brandon is claiming Trey orchestrated the entire Ponzi scheme without his knowledge, using the complex algorithms to blind him to the actual revenue deficit. To prove it, Brandon just surrendered a cache of internal emails. What kind of emails? I asked. Emails where Trey explicitly outlines the methodology for routing the fraudulent funds through shell companies in the Cayman Islands, Diana answered. Brandon had apparently been hoarding these communications for months, anticipating a moment exactly like this. He kept a digital burn book on his own brother. Brandon is insisting that Trey was the sole architect of the fraud, begging the agents to view him as a pawn who was betrayed by his own family. The irony was staggering. Barbara had spent years conditioning her sons to project an image of unified aristocratic superiority. She had trained them to look down on outsiders, to protect the family name at all costs, and to destroy anyone who threatened their status. But she had also bred them to be ruthlessly selfish. The moment the federal trap snapped shut, that selfishness overrode every lesson of familial loyalty they had ever been taught. So they are both providing irrefutable evidence against the other, I summarized, leaning back in my chair. Exactly, Diana said, setting her tablet down on the glass desk. They think they are negotiating their own freedom. They do not realize they are just handing the federal government the rope to hang them both. The server proves Brandon authorized the fraud. The emails prove Trey built the fraud. By trying to secure a reduced sentence for themselves, they have inadvertently corroborated the entire government case. The U.S. attorney does not even need to offer a plea deal now. They have airtight confessions from guilty accomplices. I looked out the window, watching the yellow cabs crawl through the Manhattan traffic far below. For years, Brandon and Trey had operated with total impunity, convinced their wealth and their family name made them untouchable. They had looked at my hard work and my ethics as weaknesses to be exploited. They had thought my patience was a sign of submission. Are they going to be granted bail? I asked. Diana answered me no. Diana's prediction about bail proved only partially correct. While Trey was remanded into federal custody as a flight risk, Brandon's desperate maneuvering and eager willingness to act as the government's star witness earned him a sliver of leniency. The next afternoon, Diana called me with an update. A federal magistrate had granted Brandon release on a heavily restricted bond. He had surrendered his passport, submitted to GPS ankle monitoring, and drained the absolute last of his hidden, undeclared cash reserves to secure a predatory bail bondsman. He was walking out of the federal detention center stripped of his dignity, but clinging to the delusion that he still had a safety net. I knew exactly what that safety net was supposed to be. Brandon had been maintaining a sprawling, expensive affair with an influencer named Sienna. He had showered her with gifts, paid the rent on her apartment, and given her unlimited access to his leased Aston Martin. He genuinely believed that his extravagant investments in this woman guaranteed her absolute loyalty. I decided to witness his release personally. I instructed my driver to park my armored sedan across the street from the federal building. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and a freezing, relentless rain was washing over the city streets. Brandon emerged through the heavy glass doors of the precinct just after 4 o'clock. He looked haggard and hollowed out. He was not wearing a tie, and the collar of his dress shirt was dark with sweat and rain. He stood under the minimal shelter of the concrete awning. He immediately reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone, his thumb tapping the screen frantically. He was looking for the sleek silver profile of the Aston Martin. He expected Sienna to be idling at the curb, waiting to whisk him away to her warm apartment. I watched him through the tinted rain-streaked glass of my car. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The rain intensified, sweeping sideways in freezing sheets that soaked the lower half of his trousers. Brandon paced back and forth, holding the phone to his ear, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and confusion. He hung up and dialed again. He checked his watch. He peered down the busy avenue, flinching every time a silver car drove past. His desperation was palpable, radiating across the street like a physical frequency. What Brandon did not know was that I had already received a comprehensive briefing on Sienna's whereabouts from my private investigator. Sienna was not stuck in Manhattan traffic. She was not circling the block waiting for federal agents to clear the loading zone. Sienna was currently sitting in the first-class cabin of a flight bound for Dubai, sipping champagne and completely off the grid. When the news of the federal raid on the Waverly penthouse broke yesterday morning, it sent shockwaves through Brandon's carefully curated social circles. Sienna had seen the headlines. She immediately recognized that her personal ATM was about to be permanently disconnected. Instead of standing by the man who had funded her extravagant lifestyle, she executed a flawless, ruthless exit strategy. She knew Brandon kept the spare keys and the lease documents for the Aston Martin in the safe of her apartment. She also knew exactly how to forge his signature. My investigator had tracked the vehicle's GPS signal before it abruptly vanished. Sienna had not simply driven the car out of state. She had driven the $300,000 luxury sports car directly to a highly organized chop shop. Using the forged documents and her intimate knowledge of Brandon's security passwords, she sold the vehicle for $80,000 in untraceable cash. The mechanics at the warehouse immediately stripped the GPS tracker, disconnected the battery, and began dismantling the car for parts. Sienna took the cash, booked a one-way international ticket, and vanished before the federal agents even finished cataloging the evidence at the penthouse. I watched Brandon as the reality of his situation began to fracture his composure. His phone battery was clearly dying. He kept shaking the device, hitting the power button in a futile attempt to force it to work. He marched up to a passing pedestrian, gesturing wildly, likely begging to borrow a phone or ask for a charger. The pedestrian took one look at his frantic state and hurried away in the downpour. Brandon retreated to the concrete wall of the federal building. He was completely soaked now. His expensive leather shoes were submerged in a growing puddle of icy rainwater. His posture crumpled. The illusion of the untouchable venture capitalist was entirely stripped away, leaving only a shivering bankrupt criminal standing on a cold sidewalk. He had no penthouse, no company, no family, and no allies. His mother was facing eviction. His brother was locked in a holding cell cooperating with prosecutors to ensure Brandon took the absolute maximum sentence. His wife had orchestrated his financial ruin and watched him fall. And the mistress he thought he could rely on had robbed him blind and fled the country. He stared down at his dead cell phone, the blank black screen reflecting his own ruined image. He had absolutely zero assets to his name. His bank accounts were frozen by the federal government. His credit cards were flagged and canceled. He did not even have the cash to hail a cab or ride the subway. I rolled down my window just an inch, letting the cold air filter into the quiet, heated cabin of my car. I watched him raise his face to the pouring rain, his shoulders shaking as he finally realized the absolute totality of his destruction. He was trapped in a prison of his own making, long before the trial even began. I tapped the partition separating me from my driver. "Drive," I commanded softly. The heavy sedan pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving Brandon Preston behind in the storm exactly where he belonged. The freezing Manhattan rain was only the beginning of Brandon's prolonged humiliation. With his federal assets frozen and his personal wealth stolen by a fleeing mistress, he was reduced to begging for legal representation. He secured a bottom-feeding attorney advertising on bus stop benches, Marcus Vance, whose suits fit poorly and smelled faintly of stale coffee. A week later, we sat in a sterile courtroom in the New York State Family Court. This was the arena where Brandon hoped to undo the absolute financial ruin of our default divorce judgment. I sat beside Diana at the petitioner's table. I wore a tailored charcoal blazer, my posture relaxed but commanding. Across the aisle, Brandon looked like a completely different man. The bespoke Italian suits were gone, replaced by an ill-fitting, off-the-rack jacket he had likely borrowed. His face was gaunt, his eyes darting around the room with a trapped, frantic energy. He was no longer an untouchable venture capitalist. He was a desperate man backed into a corner, hoping to manipulate a family court judge, the same way he had manipulated his investors and his family. The Honorable Judge Beatrice Carter presided over the session. She was a woman known for her zero-tolerance policy toward grandstanding. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the petition to vacate the default divorce judgment. Marcus Vance stood up, adjusting his cheap tie. "Your Honor, my client is petitioning to vacate the default judgment entered against him last month." Mr. Preston was experiencing severe emotional and medical distress during that period. He was systematically locked out of his marital home, denied access to his personal records, and deliberately kept in the dark by opposing counsel. He was unaware of the filing deadlines. He simply asks for a fair day in court to contest the inequitable distribution of assets. Brandon decided this was his moment to perform. He stood up beside his lawyer, his voice trembling as he forced tears into his eyes. "Your Honor, I was manipulated. She froze my accounts. She orchestrated a campaign to destroy my mental health. I never even saw the divorce papers. I was completely blindsided. She took everything from me while I was too sick to defend myself." Judge Carter did not look sympathetic. She did not look mildly interested in his performance. She slowly closed the file on her desk and folded her hands. Diana leaned back in her chair, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "We did not need to offer a rebuttal. The judge was already doing the work for us. You claim you were completely blindsided, Mr. Preston." Judge Carter said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. "You claim you never saw the papers." Brandon nodded eagerly, wiping a fabricated tear from his cheek. "Yes, Your Honor. I was kept entirely in the dark." The judge picked up a thick-bound folder and let it drop onto the wooden bench with a loud, resounding thud. "That is fascinating, Mr. Preston, because I have in front of me a sworn affidavit from a licensed process server, supported by photographic and digital evidence detailing 14 separate instances of successful service." Brandon's face instantly drained of color. He opened his mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Do not interrupt me," she snapped. "Let us review the logs. On October 12th, you were served outside the Waverly penthouse. You instructed your private security detail to throw the documents into a storm drain. On October 15th, you were served at a restaurant in Tribeca. You tossed the envelope back at the server and told him to charge it to your tab." The judge flipped a page, her eyes narrowing. "It gets better. On October 22nd, you were served while boarding a chartered helicopter. Not only did you accept the papers, but you actively documented the event for your social media followers." Judge Carter reached into the folder and pulled out a stack of glossy, high-resolution printouts. She held up the first photograph for the entire courtroom to see. It was a screenshot of Brandon's Instagram account. He was standing on the tarmac, holding the legal summons in one hand and a lit cigar in the other. The caption read, "My ex-wife's lawyers trying to ruin my weekend getaway. Cute effort, but eagles do not concern themselves with the opinions of pigeons." The judge held up another printout. "Here is a video still from November 3rd. You are using the second summons as a coaster for a Scotch glass at an exclusive members-only club. You tagged the location and added a poll asking your followers if you should use the rest of the pages to light the fireplace." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Marcus Vance slowly sank back into his chair, physically distancing himself from his own client. Brandon stood frozen, his jaw hanging open, the carefully constructed victim persona shattering into a million irrecoverable pieces. "You mocked the legal system," Mr. Preston Judge Carter stated, her voice echoing with finality. "You treated this court, the process servers, and the dissolution of your marriage as a joke for your digital audience. You deliberately and repeatedly ignored legal mandates because you believed the rules did not apply to you. You were not manipulated. You were arrogant." Brandon gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "Your Honor, please, I just need a chance to negotiate the assets. I have nothing left." "You had 14 chances, Mr. Preston," the judge replied coldly. "And you used them as props for social media engagement. This court does not reward willful negligence or blatant disrespect for the judicial process. The motion to vacate is denied. The default judgment stands permanently. All asset distributions, account seizures, and property transfers awarded to the petitioner are final. We are adjourned." The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room like a gunshot. It was the final nail in the coffin of Brandon's former life. The sharp crack of the gavel hung in the air as Judge Carter swept out. Marcus Vance did not waste a second. The cheap attorney shoved his legal pads into his battered briefcase, ignoring the man paralyzed beside him. Brandon remained rooted to the spot, his hands gripping the table so tightly his knuckles resembled polished bone. The reality of the upheld default judgment was finally penetrating his skull. He had no penthouse, no hidden offshore accounts, no sports cars, and no venture capital firm. The court had transferred every single marital asset into my name. Diana calmly clicked her briefcase shut, a picture of professional satisfaction. She gave me a brief nod and motioned toward the heavy oak doors. We had won. But as we turned to leave, a harsh, desperate voice echoed across the empty gallery. "Stella, wait, do not walk out that door yet." Brandon scrambled out from behind the defense table, nearly tripping over a chair to intercept us. He blocked the center aisle, breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his damp, ugly jacket. His eyes were wild, bloodshot, and frantic. I stopped, crossing my arms, waiting in silence. Diana stepped slightly in front of me, instinctively shielding her client, but I placed a hand on her shoulder to let her know I was perfectly fine. I wanted to hear his final plea. Brandon swallowed hard, trying to summon his old, charismatic authority, but he only managed to look pathetic. "Fine," he spat, his voice vibrating with rage. "You get the real estate. You get the investment portfolios. You can keep the offshore accounts the feds have not seized yet. But there is one thing you cannot have. I want the intellectual property rights to the Nexus application." It was the very first piece of software Brandon had ever coded, long before Trey became the architect of their fraudulent empire. It was a legitimate, clean algorithm. It was never implicated in the federal indictment because it was disconnected from their scheme. Brandon stared at me, his jaw trembling. "That code is the only clean asset I have left in this world. It is the only thing the federal government cannot touch. I need those IP rights, Stella. I will sign whatever non-disclosure agreements your lawyers want, but you have to sign the patent release over to me right now. It is my code. I wrote it. You have no idea what it actually does or how to monetize it. Hand it over to me." I did not flinch. I simply looked at the broken man standing in front of me and allowed a slow, genuine smile to spread across my face. Brandon noticed the smile, and his frantic energy faltered, replaced by a sudden dread. He looked at Diana, who was pulling a crisp sheet of paper from her leather portfolio. Diana extended her arm, holding the document out to him. "Take it," she ordered coldly. "Read the third paragraph on page 12 of the finalized default judgment decree." Brandon snatched the paper, his eyes darting frantically across the dense legal text. I watched his breathing stop. "You see, Brandon?" I began, keeping my voice perfectly calm and measured. "When you decided to ignore 14 separate court summons, you forfeited your right to negotiate the division of our marital property. You committed absolute financial abandonment. You hid assets, you emptied our accounts, and you fled the jurisdiction. Because of your blatant financial abuse, the judge did not just award me the physical properties and the bank accounts. The court awarded me 100% of all intellectual property created during our marriage." Brandon stared at the document, his hands shaking so violently the paper rattled. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. "No, that is impossible. You cannot take Nexus. It is my foundational code. It is my life work. It is my property," I corrected him sharply. "Legally, entirely, and permanently mine. And you are right about one thing, Brandon. I do not know how to write software code. I do not understand the technical nuances of your complex algorithm. But I absolutely know how to recognize a valuable asset, and I certainly know how to monetize it." Brandon looked up, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. "What did you do?" he choked out. I smiled again, letting the silence stretch for a moment to maximize the impact. "I did not let it gather any dust," I explained smoothly. "Last week, while you were busy trying to secure a bail bondsman and crying in a federal interrogation room, I had my corporate acquisition team reach out to Silicon Dynamics. They have been looking to acquire an independent sorting algorithm to integrate into their cloud infrastructure. They reviewed the Nexus code. They absolutely loved it. They bought the exclusive perpetual rights to the entire intellectual property. The ink on the final contract dried yesterday afternoon. They paid $10 million in cash. The color drained completely from his face, leaving him a ghastly, translucent white. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The staggering weight of his own arrogance crashed down upon him all at once. If he had simply acted like an adult, if he had answered a single legal summons, if he had not treated the divorce court like a joke for his social media followers, he would have retained his rights to that code. He would have had $10 million to pay his federal defense attorneys. Instead, his ego had handed me the exact weapon I desperately needed to finalize his absolute ruin. His knees physically buckled under the sudden immense strain. He collapsed onto the cold marble floor of the courtroom, his hands clutching his head as a guttural sob tore from his throat. I did not offer a single word of comfort or pity. I simply stepped around his kneeling form, pushed open the heavy oak doors, and walked out into the bright, blinding sunlight of a new day. The 24-hour eviction window closed at 8 o'clock. Inside the Waverly penthouse, the atmosphere was thick with panic. The grand illusion had officially expired. Barbara paced the living room, clutching a frayed silk robe around her shoulders. She muttered, insisting her lawyer would call to halt the proceedings. Monica sat on the floor, stuffing cheap cosmetics and wrinkled clothing into trash bags. Federal agents had already seized their designer luggage. Brandon and Trey sat on a dismantled sofa, staring blankly at the marble floor. They had returned to a home that was no longer theirs. The heavy silence in the room was broken only by the ticking grandfather clock. A heavy pounding on the mahogany double doors echoed through the halls. It was a demand. United States Marshals Service, open the door immediately. Barbara froze, her face draining of all color. Brandon closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Trey let out a pathetic whimper, pulling his knees to his chest. When nobody moved to answer, the heavy doors were forcefully breached, swinging inward with a violent crash. 4 federal marshals stepped into the penthouse, their stern expressions stripping away the last remnants of the Preston family dignity. The lead marshal held up a clipboard, his eyes sweeping over the scene. "The eviction order is now active," the marshal announced, his voice booming with uncompromising authority. "You have exactly 10 minutes to gather your remaining personal effects and vacate the premises. Anything left behind will be considered abandoned property and disposed of accordingly." Barbara stepped forward, her voice shaking with manufactured outrage. "You cannot do this. We are the Prestons. This is a misunderstanding. I demand to speak to whoever is in charge." The marshal did not blink. "I am in charge, ma'am. You have 9 minutes remaining." Panic finally set in. Monica scrambled to her feet, dragging 2 trash bags across the marble floor. The sound of plastic scraping against stone was deafening. Brandon stood up, moving like a sleepwalker. He grabbed a duffel bag containing a few changes of clothes, all that remained of his curated life. Trey followed suit, clutching a grocery bag filled with toiletries. Barbara refused to pack. She stood in the center of the room, crying hysterically, demanding someone call the mayor to stop this humiliation. 2 marshals stepped forward, firmly grasping Barbara by the arms. "Time is up," the lead marshal stated. "Let us go." They escorted her toward the door. Barbara screamed, her manicured nails digging into the marshal's sleeves, but her physical resistance was futile. Monica followed, weeping openly, struggling under the dead weight of her garbage bags. Brandon and Trey walked behind them, heads bowed, marching in a silent procession of absolute shame. They were led out of the penthouse and into the private elevator. The descent felt like a terrifying eternity. The mirrored walls of the elevator reflected their total ruin, displaying a broken family stripped of their wealth. When the elevator doors opened into the grand lobby, the humiliation peaked. The building staff people Brandon and Barbara had treated with disdain for years stood silently watching the procession. The doorman did not hold the door. The concierge did not offer a polite greeting. They watched as the marshals escorted the Preston family out of the building and pushed them onto the filthy New York sidewalk. "Do not return to this property," the marshal instructed, standing squarely in the doorway. "If you step foot on these premises again, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." The heavy glass doors slammed shut, locking the family outside. Brandon, Trey, Monica, and Barbara stood on the cracked concrete, surrounded by pedestrians rushing to work. They were a pathetic spectacle, a wealthy family reduced to standing in the gutter with black plastic trash bags. Monica dropped her bags onto the sidewalk, burying her face in her hands. Barbara stared up at the towering facade of the Waverly penthouse, her makeup running down her face in dark streaks. Trey sank onto a fire hydrant, staring blankly at the traffic. Brandon stood motionless, his jaw clenched, his eyes hollow. Then, as if the universe decided to participate in their brutal eviction, the skies cracked open. It did not just rain. It was a sudden torrential downpour. Icy water battered the city streets, instantly soaking the Preston family to the bone. Monica shrieked as the freezing rain ruined her clothes. Barbara tried to use a trash bag to shield her hair, looking utterly ridiculous. Brandon and Trey did not try to seek cover. They stood in the deluge, accepting the physical punishment as the final manifestation of their utter collapse. The water washed over them, but it could not wash away their crimes. High above the flooded street, 20 stories up in a neighboring luxury high-rise, I stood on my private terrace. I held a steaming mug of black coffee in my hands. The glass canopy above my balcony shielded me entirely from the violent storm. I wore a cashmere sweater, perfectly warm and secure. I looked down at the street below. Through the thick sheets of falling rain, I could just make out the pathetic figures of my former family huddled together on the sidewalk, surrounded by their soggy garbage. I took a slow sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor. For years, they tried to break me. They stole my work, mocked my ethics, and attempted to discard me when I was no longer useful to them. They believed they were the predators, and I was the prey. But they had underestimated my resilience. I methodically dismantled their empire piece by piece, exposing their fraud and reclaiming everything they had stolen. I did not feel pity as I watched them shiver in the cold rain. I felt profound, absolute peace. The storm was ravaging their lives, but I remained completely untouched. I turned my back on the street, stepped inside my warm, quiet home, and slid the glass door shut. The morning after the eviction brought no relief for the Preston family. Their spectacular downfall dominated the financial news networks and local tabloids. Brandon and Trey were officially remanded to a federal holding facility in Lower Manhattan. The temporary bail Brandon had secured was revoked after prosecutors demonstrated he was a severe flight risk with no remaining collateral. The brothers now shared a bleak concrete cell, barely larger than the walk-in closet of their former penthouse. They spent their days in identical orange jumpsuits, eating processed cafeteria food, and waiting for a federal trial that promised to deliver decades behind bars. Their sprawling network of influential friends and powerful politicians had vanished overnight. No one answered their collect calls. No one sent character references to the judge. They were completely isolated, facing the absolute destruction of their lives, with only the suffocating weight of their own crimes for company. The empire of lies they had built on the backs of stolen innovations and fraudulent investments had crumbled to dust, leaving them buried under the rubble. Barbara and Monica faced a different kind of prison. With their assets seized and bank accounts frozen, they had no choice but to rely on the meager emergency funds Monica had managed to hide in a shoebox. It was barely enough to secure a cramped, dilapidated studio apartment in a decaying building on the outskirts of Queens. The reality of their new existence was a brutal shock to their delicate sensibilities. There were no doormen, no private elevators, and no housekeeping staff. The apartment smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp rot. The single window looked out onto a brick wall covered in grime. Barbara, who had spent the last 20 years draped in designer silk and dripping with diamonds, was forced to sleep on a sagging pull-out sofa. She spent her days crying, clutching a cheap plastic mug of instant coffee, and mourning the loss of her social status. Monica, trapped in the same tiny room, grew increasingly bitter. The two women constantly bickered, their shared misery turning them against each other. Monica blamed Barbara for raising an arrogant son, while Barbara blamed Monica for failing to secure her own financial independence before the collapse. They were locked in a miserable, suffocating dynamic, utterly devoid of the luxury they believed was their birthright. While they suffocated in the consequences of their actions, I breathed freely for the first time in years. The acquisition of the Nexus application had solidified my absolute financial independence, but it was the profound sense of justice that tasted the sweetest. I had not just survived their attempts to destroy me, I had meticulously dismantled their entire world. I walked away with the real estate, the intellectual property, and my dignity fully intact. The toxic shadows they had cast over my life were entirely eradicated. I spent the following weeks tying up loose ends, finalizing the transfer of the remaining assets, and ensuring my corporate infrastructure was bulletproof. With my business thriving and my personal life completely cleansed of their poison, it was time to collect my ultimate reward. A week later, the sky above New York was a brilliant, cloudless blue. A sleek black town car glided smoothly onto the private tarmac at Teterboro Airport, coming to a halt beside a gleaming Gulfstream jet. My driver opened the door and I stepped out into the crisp morning air. I wore a tailored cream linen suit, my hair falling in loose, effortless waves. I did not carry any heavy emotional baggage, nor did I carry my own luggage. A polite attendant seamlessly transferred my designer travel bags from the trunk to the aircraft hold. I paused for a moment on the tarmac, adjusting my sunglasses against the bright glare of the sun. The deafening roar of commercial planes in the distance felt like a symphony of freedom. I had orchestrated this exact moment with relentless precision, and standing here on the precipice of absolute peace was exhilarating. I climbed the stairs of the private jet and was greeted by a smiling flight attendant holding a silver tray. I took a crystal flute filled with chilled vintage champagne. The interior of the cabin was a sanctuary of cream leather, polished mahogany, and flawless service. I sank into the plush captain's seat, the soft leather conforming perfectly to my posture. I crossed my legs, took a slow, deliberate sip of the champagne, and let the delicate bubbles burst against my tongue. The flavor was crisp, complex, and victorious. I listened to the hum of the engines as the jet taxied down the runway, gathering speed with effortless grace. The smooth acceleration pressed me gently back into my seat. As the aircraft lifted off the ground, ascending gracefully into the clouds, I looked out the window. The sprawling gray expanse of New York City shrank beneath me. The towering skyscrapers where Brandon and Trey had once plotted their schemes looked like meaningless toys from this altitude. I traced the outline of Manhattan with my eyes, knowing that somewhere down there in the dense concrete maze, the people who tried to break me were suffering the exact fate they deserved. I had excised them from my life, like malignant tumors, cutting them out with cold, calculated, and surgical precision. They were no longer my problem. They were barely a memory. The jet banked south, pointing its nose toward a pristine, remote island in the Caribbean, a place of white sand, turquoise water, and absolute tranquility. I had earned every second of this peaceful vacation. I rested my head against the plush leather seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment of pure satisfaction. The heavy burdens of the past were entirely gone. The screen of my life was clear and bright. I opened my eyes, took one final look at the fading city below, and allowed a triumphant, unbothered smile to illuminate my face before the scene gracefully faded to black.